Welcome to Our Missouri, a podcast about the people, places, culture, and history of the 114 counties and independent city of St. Louis that comprise the great state of Missouri. Each episode focuses on a topic related to the state, ranging from publications about Missouri's history to current projects undertaken by organizations to preserve and promote local institutions. The Our Missouri podcast is recorded at the Center for Missouri Studies in Columbia and is generously provided to you by the State Historical Society of Missouri. And now, here's your host, Sean Rost.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, or whatever hour you're tuning in to listen to the Our Missouri podcast. My name is Sean Rost, and I'll be your guide to explore the memories, moments, and misfortunes from Our Missouri. In honor of the state's 200th birthday, Our Missouri will feature a series throughout 2021 entitled Bicentennial Book Club, which discusses award-winning publications that detail the state's diverse history, as well as the stories behind the stories featured within their pages. Our guest today is Diane Moody Burke. She holds a PhD in history from Emory University, and presently she is a professor of history and director of the Center for Midwestern Studies at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She has co-edited 3 anthologies in the Missouri-Kansas border region, including Kansas City, America's Crossroads, Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri, The Long Civil War on the Border, and Wide Open Town, Kansas City during the Pendergast era. Her first book, On Slavery's Border, Missouri's Small Slaveholding Households, 1815 to 1865, is our focus for today. Welcome to Our Missouri, Diane.
Thanks for having me.
Now, tell us about the origins of this book project, On Slavery's Border. How did that all begin?
Well, I actually grew up here in Missouri and, went to Missouri schools through high school. And so I always loved history since I was a very small child and was always interested in 19th century, really Civil War era history. And so I knew that Missouri was a border state. I also knew that it was a slave state, but I really never learned much, if really anything, about how slavery operated here. And my sense was that there were some differences when compared to the Deep South. I went to college, I took a Southern history class, I learned a lot about what happened in places like Virginia and South Carolina and Mississippi, but I didn't learn much about Missouri in that class either. So when I decided to work on an undergraduate senior thesis, so the origins of this book go way back, I decided that I wanted to focus on this question of slavery in Missouri. And as I got more into that project, doing the research, and then ultimately writing this senior thesis, I found that I had stumbled upon a really important historiographical question, which is how did location and size of slavery units, how did that influence the experience of slavery and slaveholding in the American South? And so once I realized that this was really an important question that was honestly quite understudied in slavery studies and that focus on the American South, I decided that this was something that I needed to pursue in graduate school, and then ultimately it ended up as my first book.
Now, as you're doing the research for this project and really getting into the primary source documents and secondary source documents, what archives are you visiting? What historic sites are you going to? I mean, what are the materials you're going through to help build this research project?
Well, at the time that I was doing the bulk of the research for this project, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I made a lot of research trips back to Missouri. And most of my archival research was conducted at the State Historical Society of Missouri. So then it was called the Western Historical Manuscripts Collection. The name has now changed. So I spent a lot of time in Columbia at the manuscripts collection. I actually spent a lot of time on the UMKC campus. I would oftentimes have documents shipped through their wonderful shipping process between their various sites. And I viewed a lot of the Columbia documents in Kansas City because my parents lived in Kansas City, so I had a free place to stay. That actually is the vast majority of the archival documents or the manuscript collections that I explored. But I also spent quite a bit of time at the National Archives and Records Center in Washington, D.C., looking at pension records of soldiers that had served in the Civil War, Black soldiers who had served in the Civil War. So I spent weeks and weeks there photocopying all these pension records that I ended up examining to try to understand a little bit more about enslaved people's lives during slavery. That gave me a really wonderful view into people's family and community lives. And those records ended up being invaluable to my project. I also, of course, used the WPA slave narratives and the few escaped slave narratives that were written by people who had been enslaved in Missouri. So people like William Wells Brown and Henry Bruce and Elizabeth Keckley, and there are a couple others, those were all really valuable resources as well. I spent a little bit of time at the Missouri State Archives, at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis at their archives, and then some other smaller repositories such as the Jackson County Historical Society. But the bulk of my research was the Western Historical Manuscripts Collection and the National Archives.
Now, before we jump into the key subject matter, the key themes that emerge within your book, to get a kind of an idea of the state of Missouri, where did slavery exist throughout the state when we look at that period prior to the Civil War?
Well, there were enslaved people literally in every county in Missouri, but the largest concentration of enslaved people and the largest concentrations were in the counties along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, but especially in what later became known as Little Dixie. So central Missouri River counties west to the state line. So in these places, the enslaved population ranged from around 15% of the population to even over 35%. So for example, in 1860, there were 6,374 enslaved people in Lafayette County, or that comprised 32% of the total population. 886 enslaved people in Howard County, or 37% of the population. And in Boone County, the enslaved population, and again, this is in 1860, was 5,034 people, or 26% of the population. But to sort of fill out the other counties in that top 10 list of the largest enslaved populations, those were Callaway and Saline and St. Louis, although that's really interesting because the enslaved population only made up 2% of the city's population, even though the numbers were actually high, because that city had over 190,000 people living in it in 1860. So as a percentage of the population, it was really small, but it was one of the 10 largest slaveholding counties. And then the others were Pike and Jackson and Cooper and Clay counties.
Now, when looking at, as you define that, kind of what later becomes known as Little Dixie, that region around the Mississippi River Valley there, slavery is significant in Missouri's history, not only in elements of economic, social, cultural, political history, but how had scholars looked at this subject matter? We could say prior to your book, as you're prepping, what authors are you reading and what are they saying about enslaved people and slavery in Missouri?
Well, it wasn't really studied in a very comprehensive way. It was, by and large, as I talked about earlier, left out of larger studies of slavery. I mean, sometimes they would sort of cherry pick anecdotes that they had mostly pulled out of the WPA slave narratives, which of course were the interviews that were conducted during the 1930s as part of the Works Progress Administration. So they're interviews of mostly, exclusively elderly people, and and have a lot of challenges that are inherent in those interviews, but they're still a very rich way to examine slavery. So occasionally historians would take a really great story that would prove whatever point they wanted it to prove from Missouri, but they weren't really examining slavery in Missouri and trying to figure out exactly how it operated here and if there were any differences. There was one major work that I found in the library in my undergraduate college, back in the stacks, this really, really old, text that had been published in 1914 by a scholar named Harrison Trexler. And you can imagine that that book, although there were some really important details in the book, that it was problematic in a lot of ways because of when it was written. It certainly was not influenced by any of the newer scholarship on slavery, and it was written in a time where there were much more racist views on all of this, and so you had to kind of work through that. There's a really great book by R. Douglas Hurt about slavery and agriculture in Little Dixie, and there were various articles and dissertations, but there really hadn't been a comprehensive book written about slavery in Missouri, and there certainly wasn't one that focused on the questions that I was interested in, which were, what were people's everyday existences like? How do people live? How did they work? What were their relationships with each other? What were their family and community lives like? And people really hadn't focused on any of that because, especially when Trexler wrote, nobody was even thinking about those kinds of questions. They were more interested in the politics and the economics of slavery than they were in how people live their everyday lives.
I will admit I had to go through Trexler after reading your book the first time and trying to see the comparison there and talking about that. So I appreciated you discussing that for understanding Trexler and a book that is now, 100 plus years old.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a really long time between major books on slavery in Missouri, for sure.
Now you talked about there just briefly that with the focus on the everyday existence and really life within kind of slaveholding households and society in Missouri. So talk about that focus, really what brought you to focus in on that, and what were you finding in the research in relation to that?
Well, honestly, this is what really interests me about history. I'm interested in the politics and the wars and the economics, but I'm really interested in how people live their everyday lives, or what historians would call social history. So I want to see how people related to one another, how they lived and worked together. I want to see how their families were structured and their communities, and I think a lot of this came from an interest in women's history. Certainly at the time that Trexler was writing, he wasn't spending much, if any, time talking about the experiences of women or children, but those were both things that really were interesting to me as a historian. So although, in my book, I talk about politics and I talk about economics, I'm really interested in the social history and trying to explore, what was happening within these households. And, ultimately, did it look any different than what was happening within the, so-called big house on a plantation, which was honestly, has been where a lot of the research has been focused to try to understand these relationships between people on plantations. And so, I wanted to basically give that kind of a treatment to these households in Missouri and see if there were any similarities or if there were any differences, and then try to explain those.
Now, in going through that, what, if anything, surprised you about this everyday experience, about life in Missouri as an enslaved person, or even the person who is involved in the enslavement?
Well, the first thing that I realized, well, I guess that's not really right to say the first thing, because it took a lot of research to come to this conclusion. But one of the things that I was working against was this idea that slavery was somehow milder or more domestic in a place like Missouri. And I say a place like Missouri because there were other parts of the South where small-scale slavery predominated. So what the reality was in Missouri is that most slavery units, these households that engaged or owned, and I'm putting that in air quotes. Certainly legally at the time they owned other human beings. It's, we obviously don't agree with that idea today. And so, it's hard to to grapple with that language, honestly. But, in these households, they were smaller units. In most slaveholding households in Missouri, there were 10 or fewer enslaved people. And so that meant that on most of these farms, and they like to call themselves plantations because, to them that sounded, very fancy, I think. But they were farming operations that engaged or forced enslaved labor. But in most cases, most of these farms only had a few adult enslaved people living on them, and the rest of the enslaved individuals were children. So what did this mean? Did it mean the relationships were better or worse? Certainly there was this idea that Missourians like to promote, even back during slavery times, that somehow slavery was better, it was more benign here, it was milder because of these close household relations. This was sort of the idea that they were trying to sell. And honestly, that idea has really persisted up until today, that somehow it was maybe an easier form or better, which is obviously a problematic word, but somehow a better or milder form of slavery, because they primarily were not growing cotton here because the growing seasons were not reliable for massive cotton cultivation. They were growing hemp and tobacco, but also a lot of other they were engaged in diversified agriculture. So there were cash crops, to be sure, and access to the river really made that possible. They were able to ship their crops to market, but they were also engaged in a lot of other kind of agricultural practices that kept their households running. And so, kitchen gardens and raising livestock and poultry and hogs and all the things that they needed to make these operations economically profitable, but also feed the people that were living within the household. So as I dug into this and tried to understand what exactly this meant for enslaved people and for their enslavers within these households, was it actually better? And what I found was that in most cases, not. I mean, it looked really, in a lot of ways, the same as it would look anywhere else. There was this continuum of relationships and behaviors that ranged from, within the confines of slavery. So, I want to qualify that it's not, slavery is never good, but in some cases, people were treated a little bit better. And then, I saw every form of abuse that you could imagine that, historians have seen in other parts of the South. They all happened here as well. And I think actually because people were living and working so closely together. So in Missouri, on most of these properties, there were not overseers because there was not such a large enslaved population on the various properties that they really warranted, the expense of hiring an overseer. So in most cases, the work was supervised by the owner of the farm, perhaps his sons, and the household work was supervised by the wife and the daughters within these households. And so because people were living in fairly close proximity to one another, it's very typical in Missouri for enslaved people to live in outbuildings on the farm properties. So not an independent, well, it was not independent, but a slave quarter that was sort of set at a distance from the, again, the so-called big house. They were living in cabins in the barnyard, basically in the farmyard. And so really close to white people's homes, sometimes even within their homes. And so this, created these situations where people knew one another pretty well. And I would argue that enslaved people knew white people probably better. It was in their best interest to really study the personalities and the behaviors of their white enslavers. But they did know each other and interact with each other on a daily basis in all these kinds of intimate ways. And because of that, it would sometimes cause the situations to spiral out of control really quickly. If one person or the other's expectations were not met, if somebody felt insulted, things could get really ugly very quickly. And while sometimes that behavior, violence, especially, was perpetrated by enslaved people, but vastly more often it was perpetrated by white people against enslaved people. So just as a baseline, I want to debunk this idea that somehow slavery was milder or better, or the conditions were markedly better. Now, the one thing that I will qualify this with is saying that, the climate is better in Missouri than it is in Mississippi or Louisiana. So there were some better aspects there. And the work routines were perhaps not as harsh for most of the time as they would have been on a cotton plantation or a sugar plantation in Louisiana. But there were times when the work regime was very harsh, like during hemp breaking season, or tobacco is very labor intensive. So I don't want to sugarcoat that too much, but you could make a slight argument about that. But by and large, slavery is slavery, and it's a horrible, horrible institution. The other thing that I discovered, which I thought was really interesting and made a contribution to the study of slavery in America, is this idea of what happened in these small scale slavery neighborhoods, communities where the vast majority of slaveholdings were small, how that influenced people's family and community lives. And that was really, really interesting. And again, this is information, a lot of which I learned through studying those pension claims and also the WPA slave narratives, but the pension claims were really excellent for trying to understand how this all worked. So what I found is that in Missouri, there was a large percentage of abroad families. So this was a term that they used at the time and that historians still use today. So what that means is that husbands and wives, couples who had formed families, lived on two different properties. So they were claimed by two different slaveholders. So, and this was, purely because of the demographics. These were not large plantations with dozens and dozens of enslaved people, and whoever you lived with on your own property was probably related to you. So people had to go looking elsewhere for marriage or sexual partners. And I do want to say that marriages were not legally recognized among enslaved people during this time, but they were seen by the community as marriages. And so the way that this worked is that enslaved men and women would meet one another out in the community, at church, perhaps at different social gatherings, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And they formed attachments, romantic attachments to one another, relationships with one another, and decided that they wanted to form a family, to be married. And then the white people would recognize these relationships and would allow the men, and it was always the men, to go and visit their families. And usually the way that worked is that men would leave after work on Saturday afternoon or evening and would walk or travel some way. Sometimes slaveholders gave them horses to ride. This was pretty unusual, but so they would usually walk to go visit their families. They typically stayed with them Sunday, and then they would leave either late Sunday evening or early Monday morning to be back ready for work on Monday morning. Sometimes they visited more often if they lived close by. But you can see that, this was a difficult situation for families. They were reliant on white people to allow them these visiting privileges. White enslavers oftentimes used these privileges as a way to manipulate people, to get them to behave the way that they wanted them to behave, by withdrawing privileges. And it was also very tenuous as far as the possibility that these families could be split apart by various things. So let's say one white enslaver decides that he's going to move to Texas and takes one of the family members with him, or that he or she is going to sell someone. So many of these families were broken apart by this, but what was remarkable to me is how long many of these families were able to persist, sometimes with multiple owners over time. And as long as they were close enough in physical proximity to one another, they continued on with their relationships. And I should add that the way that slavery worked is the condition of children, the enslaved condition of children followed that of the mother. So the mother and the children lived on one property, and the father lived on another. And so close to 60% of the families that I could identify were part of these abroad relationships. They existed throughout the South, but in a place like Missouri, where there was such a high percentage of small scale slavery units, it was just so much more. It was the common form of family rather than families that lived on the same property with one another. So exploring how these families operated and how enslaved people were able to make this, less than ideal situation work over long periods of time was really fascinating. And what you see is when slavery ends and there's an opportunity for people to actually legalize their marriages, they do in very, very large numbers. So these relationships that started out with people living on separate properties, ultimately after the Civil War, and in many cases with people living together for the first time in many, many years. And I guess the second part of this is this idea of cross-farm enslaved communities. So there's been a lot of research on enslaved people's communities in the South, and the things that historians have pointed to as helping enslaved people mitigate the harsh and horrible experience of slavery is, family. So I've talked about that, and community, and then religion, which was mostly Protestant evangelical religions that most enslaved people by the 19th century had adopted. So, abroad families, the family situation is a little more tenuous and more difficult in a place like Missouri. And then you could extrapolate that and also talk about how enslaved communities were vulnerable because there were not slave quarter communities, again, with dozens of enslaved people living on the same property. And so how did people form communities? And there has been some suggestion by a few people that maybe they didn't. But what I found was that, in fact, they did. And again, the pension records are really wonderful for this, because the way that the pension worked is that a soldier who fought in the war, or his descendants, so if he was killed during or died during the war, his widow and his children, his orphans, could apply for a pension. Also, sometimes mothers and fathers who could prove that their son would have been their sole dependent, would have given them the money to live in their old age, they could apply as well. And so in order to get the pension, you had to prove your relationship to the individual who had died during the war. And so war widows relied on testimony from people in the community to prove their marriages, because they had no marriage records since marriages were not legal. And so what they did was they asked family members, they asked friends, sometimes ministers, sometimes former owners, to testify to their relationship, to testify to the fact that they were married during slavery times, or that they were seen by the community as married. And so these records give all this wonderful information about how people knew one another. So they talk about, knowing people because they went to church with them. And they talk about, visiting people. Men talk about visiting people like friends and neighbors on their way to visit their abroad wives. They talk about community gatherings, what they called frolics or in essence parties. So oftentimes these were sanctioned by white people in the community. So, think about something like a barn raising or a corn shucking. What they were trying to do is they were trying to leverage the labor of their friends and neighbors to try to get a job done faster and more efficiently. And so they would throw a party and have everybody come, all the white neighbors come and bring enslaved workers with them. And then, of course, the enslaved people did most of the work while the white people had a party. But then they would treat the workers to a bit of a party as well. And so people were able to meet one another through these social engagements that were sanctioned by the white community. But they also, I found lots of evidence through a whole different, through many forms of records of people meeting clandestinely. So meeting without the approval or the sanction of white Missourians. So they're meeting back in the woods for clandestine parties where there isn't a white person present, so they can dance and sing and tell stories and drink and do all the things that they want to do on their own within their own community. I've read about drinking and gambling in the woods, and there were clandestine church services, religious services that again were out of earshot of white Missourians. So people could, preachers could preach, Black preachers could preach what they wanted to preach without it being controlled, without being controlled by white people who were telling them the messages that they were supposed to impart to their listeners. So all of these kinds of activities were happening, back in the woods, at abandoned cabins, in caves, various places. And so people knew one another in their communities, and they talked about how they knew their neighbors or their near neighbors, they sometimes referred to them. So there's this really rich enslaved community within these neighborhoods. And ultimately, all of these relationships serve people really well when the Civil War happens. And, and there's this opportunity because there's a presence of Union soldiers in Missouri, and because Missouri is virtually, well, it's not virtually, it's surrounded by free states by this point, except for in the South. And so they know where to go, they know who to trust, they know the back byways and the back woods trails, so that they don't have to go on the roads. All of this they use to their advantage as they're seeking freedom during the years of the Civil War, which of course were incredibly tumultuous in Missouri.
In thinking about, we mentioned Trexler from 1914 and a couple of books on slavery in Missouri. Between that point and your book being published, since your book has been published, how do you think Missouri is interpreted within the larger narrative of American slavery in scholarship?
Well, that's a good question. I hope people are paying more attention to Missouri because it's such a, well, I mean, it has such a fascinating history for one thing, but also it's so fundamentally important in this history of the coming of the Civil War. I mean, it was, and I think has often been seen, certainly now and even back in the day, as being on the periphery of the slave South. I mean, it is the northwesternmost slave state. It has a relatively small enslaved population. In 1860, a little less than 10% of Missourians were enslaved. It certainly had this more diverse population in the last decades before the Civil War. There were, thousands upon thousands of immigrants who had come from Germany. Many of those folks were anti-slavery, although not all of them. And a lesser extent, some people from Ireland. There had been a number of people who had moved in from northern states as well. But yet, even though there's this diversity within the state, which causes some people to be concerned about whether or not Missouri will persist as a slave state, it's still as we've talked about, I mean, slavery is entrenched in the state economically, socially, and politically. And the state was often in the middle of the events in the lead up to the Civil War. So, the Missouri Compromise, I mean, the greatest hits really of all of these events that lead up to the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, the rise of Lincoln's political fortunes. I mean, he's talking about what's happening in Kansas, and what's happening in Kansas is very much has to do with the way the Missourians, especially in Western Missouri, are reacting to what's happening in Kansas. And even John Brown. I mean, John Brown is radicalized in Kansas and then goes on and stages his Harper's Ferry insurrection. So it's right in the middle of all of this, and yet historians have really not paid as much attention to it as they should. And they also have not paid as much attention to the Civil War in the West. And by this, I mean, really the Trans-Mississippi West. And all of that has started to change in the last couple of decades, which is really great. There are wonderful, wonderful books that have been written about the Civil War in the West, and they've gotten a lot of attention, which has been really wonderful. But there also has been increased attention on slavery in Missouri. It's not, I wouldn't say it's an uncharted, sort of frontier of scholarship in the sense that that nobody has written on it, but certainly more and more people are writing on it. So, wonderful books about the St. Louis freedom suits. There's Kristen Epps' book about slavery along the Missouri-Kansas border. Sharon Romeo's book about the experiences of newly freed Missouri women and the aftermath of the Civil War, and the freedom suit books, Kelly Kennington, Ann Twitty, Leah Vandervelde's. And then again, all these really wonderful books that have been written about the Civil War history of the state, which is so fascinating. I mean, that's really the thing that captivates me now. And what I hope to continue to work on. So, scholars like Chris Phillips and Jeremy Neely and Gary Kramer and Aaron Astor and Megan Bacardi and many others. So there's been so much more that has been written and published in the last 10 years. It's really wonderful to see that the state and its important role, both in slavery and in the Civil War, is finally getting some of the recognition that I think the history merits. So I think we will just continue moving forward and writing about this really interesting place.
Now, we've talked a little bit about books that came before, obviously yours, and you mentioned there many of the scholars who are writing on the subject matter that have published since your book has come out, and noted the importance of your work and how they crafted their own scholarship. But what unanswered questions remain on the subject? I mean, what should future scholars and students consider, do you think, when researching slavery in Missouri?
Well, I mean, there's always more that you could do. I remember when I was working on the book, I just kept reading more and more documents. I mean, I can't even tell you how many documents I've read. Like the pension records, I read one regiment worth. So I looked at just mostly the widows' claims and the orphans' claims, because that is what I felt like yielded the most information about their time during slavery. So, those records have not been thoroughly mined. There's certainly, I mean, for information about slavery, but also about people's experiences during the Civil War and the aftermath. I think that what happened to people after the Civil War, there's so much work that could be done on this. And there are many people who have done work on this, and including Gary Kramer. But there's still so much more that could be done. I think people could do localized studies, to really try to explore exactly how these communities operated. So I didn't do a case study I looked at, I mean, the records were mostly from Central Missouri, but I didn't, really dig in and see exactly how these networks operated within one community, for example. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. And I know that there are records that I didn't spend as much time with as I could have. I could have spent more time with legal records. I could have spent more time with newspapers. But, as with any book, at some point you feel like you have enough to tell the story and you have to stop, even though there's so much more that you could explore if you kept exploring. And there's just really a wealth of records that you could explore. You would work on the book for 50 years. So, I had to send it out there into the world. So if I were to go back and do it differently, I would have spent more time examining what happened during the Civil War. And I would have maybe examined in greater depth some of these records that I spent some time with, but I could have spent more time with. But, at some point you have to stop.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Diane.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Our Missouri podcast. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, including past and future episodes, information about guests, and upcoming events, please visit our website at shsmo.org/our-Missouri.